So you might know that there's a new Malifaux expansion coming probably at the end of this year called Ashes of Malifaux. And you also might know that oftentimes Weird will actually take models that they haven't used but have shown in games like Through the Breach and then adapt those for new expansions for Malifaux. So I thought this would be a good time to go through all the old Through the Breach expansions and pull out some of the things that look particularly interesting to me that I think they might try adapting into Malifaux for the new expansion. We've already seen teases of a handful of things that are from Through the Breach, but maybe there's a bunch more in there that we might see coming over. So I'll tell you a little bit about what these models are, where they come from, what their story is, and then we can try to speculate based on the rules that we have on where we might see them fit into Malifaux. Now, keep in mind that Through the Breach is still based on Malifaux 2nd Edition, so some of the rules will obviously be different if they were to get adapted to 3rd Edition. And also keep in mind that sometimes when they bring the models over to Malifaux, they completely change them and give them pretty dramatically new rules. So we're really just going to be using these rules as a guideline and a starting point to have the conversation. I wouldn't expect any of this stuff to come over looking exactly the same as it does. Now, in this video, I'm going to pull out 10 of these models, but there's a whole bunch more. So if you like this video, then drop a comment below and let me know, and maybe I'll do more like this in the future. But let's get into it. The Arcanist Smuggler. So this is an interesting one because we have full color art for this model, but as far as I know, it's never been used anywhere else. Now we know that a big part of the Arcanist's operations involves smuggling things back and forth to Earth, especially soulstones. And according to the little blurb we get here, it explains that these smugglers in some cases will actually swallow the soulstones like drug smugglers, but they also use some other techniques like bribing guards or using magic to conceal them. It also points out that being caught with a stolen soulstone is a death sentence from the guild, so not a job that's for the faint of heart. Now, I think a model like this might work well as an Arcanist versatile model, but I feel like there'd be a little bit of redundancy there with the Saboteur. So maybe it would make a little bit more sense if this model was part of Colette's keyword. We know that a big part of her operation at the Star Theater is smuggling, particularly soulstones. And while the showgirls help her with that work, they do tend to pass the contraband off to other people who they meet in the sewers and other places. So maybe these professional smugglers will be the contacts that she meets up with, and they could work with her and the other girls. We even see that in Through the Breach they have Don't Mind Me, which would make them fit in really well with the rest of the showgirl keyword. I'm not sure if they would play a particularly unique role within the keyword, but I'm sure they can make some tweaks to this to make them fit in a different niche. The Steelclaw Stinger. So this is a particularly large scorpion that lives in the north. And an interesting fact about them is that this is actually what the Scorpius is based on, that you might know from Marcus's crew. That's basically a Steelclaw Stinger that was augmented with mechanical parts. But for some reason, we've never seen the actual Steelclaw Stinger added to the game. Now, maybe that's because it would be too similar to the Scorpius, but I think they could do some things to make it feel a little bit different and play different. So first of all, this guy's got the yellow background, which suggests that he would be an outcast. But I feel like that's often just used as an other, or for models that don't really have a particular home in any of the other factions. It's also got the beast characteristic, which suggests that it would still work with Marcus, but I think it would be kind of interesting considering that they use the poison mechanic for this to go in the experimental keyword. We know that McMorning has worked with animals in the past. Obviously, you have the rogue necromancy, and McMorning and Marcus do have a relationship with each other, so this might be a cool way to bring that back into the storyline and show that there's still a level of cooperation between the two. Another interesting bit is that we learn in the lore here that they seem to have some sort of camouflage that lets them blend in with rocks, so maybe they can play on that a little bit in the mechanics. The Discarded Amalgam. So first off, I really love this art. I think it's a really cool looking zombie, and I'd love to see that transformed into a real model. Now, looking at this thing, you might think that it probably has a lot in common with a flesh construct, maybe too much in common. But interesting note, there is actually a separate data sheet in Through the Breach for the flesh construct, so there is a difference. Now, to my mind, bringing this guy to the game could be an interesting opportunity to fill in the gap that the flesh construct sort of used to fill. It used to be a little bit tankier and beefier than it is, so this could kind of be an amped up flesh construct, maybe somewhere between a flesh construct and Archie. Of course, this will have to go in McMorning's keyword, but I actually think another good opportunity would be to mix it up a little bit and give it a second keyword. So we know that McMorning has this tendency to do experiments and build strange creatures, and then when there's something that he doesn't like, he just kind of throws it in the sewer and lets it run free, which is exactly what this thing is. And because it's sort of a misfit, I think it would be interesting to throw it in Molly's keyword as well. Her whole thing is that she has a whole bunch of undead that are unusual or don't really fit in anywhere else that follow her around, and she's kind of like their leader. So it would make perfect sense for these guys to follow Molly as well. Another interesting bit that we get in the blurb here is that it actually seems to try to communicate with Emmeline, and that sort of suggests that it might have a little bit more intelligence than your average everyday undead, but it could also be that it recognizes Emmeline as an undead as well. Or maybe she has necromantic powers and she actually sort of took control of the amalgam without realizing it. Either way, I think it would be an interesting addition to the game, and that model's going to look sick. Now, I could have made this entire video about entries from the Bayou book because there's a whole bunch of really interesting stuff in there that we haven't seen in the game yet. A lot of those things are strange creatures and plants and all sorts of weird stuff. But one that particularly caught my eye was the Swamp People. And the reason that the Swamp People caught my eye is because I've always wanted to see more interaction between the Bayou and the rest of Malifaux. I think there could be some really interesting stories about humans interacting with gremlins in any way other than just fighting them. And we already know that there's some trading and cooperation that goes on between the two species. So the swamp people are actually people who live in Edge Point, which is a fairly large town on the border of the bayou. And it happens to border the part of the bayou where there are gremlins that are much friendlier towards humans. So these are people who have actually learned how to survive in the bayou. And according to this blurb here, they actually tend to use lower tech weapons because they're less likely to get ruined by the swamp water. The most interesting thing here would be what keywords would these guys work in? I think you could kind of make the argument for them running with any of the Bayou crews. It would make sense for them to work with the Benoits, which are a group of gremlins that live pretty close to Edge Point and tend to cooperate pretty well with humans. But they don't really have much of a presence in the game yet, so maybe they could work with Ophelia. She also lives pretty close to the border, and she seems like the type of gremlin who would make peace with humans if there was some benefit in it for her. But I think it would be even cooler if they had another keyword that was outside of the Bayou. Now, obviously we know that Parker has been willing to work with gremlins in the past, so that makes a lot of sense. And honestly, I can see these guys working with pretty much any of the outcasts because they seem like they're kind of loners that are worried about hunting and trapping and don't really care much for the rest of civilization. But what do you think? What would be your favorite pair of keywords to go for the swamp people? Okay, so my absolute number one choice for a model to come over to Malifaux is the Red Cage Abomination. We need it to happen. So if you're not familiar, the Red Cage Abominations are from a storyline from the second book of 1st edition Malifaux. And since they were introduced, we've gotten very little information about them. And it's one of those plot points that have sort of been hanging there, waiting to be resolved for a long time. Now, what we know about them is that they are creatures who were underneath the bayou. They're very old, and they seem to be made up of undead parts as well as mechanical parts. And the undead parts are actually part human and part Neverborn, which is a little bit weird considering how old they are. Now, there's a lot of theories that go around about what they might actually be, but we won't get into that here. For now, let's just talk about where they might fit in inside the game. Without a little bit more advancement of the plot, I don't really think they naturally fit in with any of the Resurrectionist Masters, at least as far as story reasons go. So they might make good versatile models for Resurrectionists, but I think if we had to fit them in just based on the theme of the sort of undead and mechanical hybrids, they would make a lot of sense working with Von Stuck or with Leviticus, because they sort of match up with a lot of things you see in those crews. I think Von Stuck's probably the higher likelihood. I could definitely see a story where he ends up in the Red Cage pit and starts studying these things and figures out how to control some of them. We also know that a few masters have actually spent some time in the Red Cage pit, including Marcus and Wong, so maybe he could fit into their crew somewhere, but I think that would be a little bit weird, because they don't really go along with the rest of those crews. But either way, we need to see it happen. If you're enjoying this video, then please consider giving it a like and making sure you're subscribed to the channel. You can also do me a huge favor and share it with some folks that you think might find it pretty interesting. In addition, if you want to help out and support the channel more directly, then you can check out the links in the description below. I have the weird affiliate link that you can use when you're shopping for weird products, and that'll actually go towards supporting the channel, as well as the merch store and the Patreon. We have a whole bunch of different tiers, and they each have different rewards associated with them, so check that out. And any support that you send will be appreciated. But let's jump back to the video. The Guild Pathologist. So these seem like the type of folks who might work in the guild morgue, cutting up dead bodies and things like that. And through the breach, they actually had the Death Marshal keyword, so I think that makes a ton of sense, because they would probably be pretty good at fighting off the undead. I think the art here would make for a pretty cool looking model, and it would be a lot different from most of what we see in the Death Marshal keyword, so that would be really cool. But an interesting angle that they might go with these models would be to tie them into the relationship with McMorning. We get some info in the blurb here that these pathologists are working for McMorning's successor, and I think it would be really cool if it turned out that some of them were actually still loyal to McMorning but stayed in the guild and didn't out themselves when he sort of made his departure. How cool would it be to have a Death Marshal and experimental keyword model? Maybe these characters would actually still be helping McMorning by getting him access to bodies and sort of keeping tabs on what's going on at the guild, while also helping Lady Justice by cracking down on McMorning's rivals. It might be a little sophisticated for the type of tactics we usually see McMorning using, but maybe if he had the opportunity, it would occur to him to take advantage of this. Oh, this art makes me really uncomfortable. Leave it to Weird to take something as innocent as a tooth fairy and turn it into this horrible abomination. Honestly, I really can't imagine that they would pass up the opportunity to turn this into a model. We can see from the stat sheet here that they have the Nightmare keyword, and according to their blurb, these things actually eat children's teeth, which is pretty horrifying in and of itself. That definitely checks out as the type of thing the Dreamer would come up with and use to terrify people when he's playing his games. I think they might make an interesting addition to his crew, because according to the stats that they have here, they're pretty fast, they can fly, and they also give the bleeding out condition. So I can see them having a mechanic where you use a bunch of them and they sort of buff each other to take out enemies with like a sort of death by 1,000 cuts style. Or just use them as scheme runners. I'm trying to think of what other keywords they might go good in, but without knowing more about them from a story perspective, it's kind of hard to say. The one I always kind of want to go to is Woe, but I feel like Dreamer and Pandora already share a bunch of models in common, so it would kind of be more interesting to see them go somewhere else if they were going to be dual keyword. The Brood Fighter. So this is one of the many different variants of Nephilim that we get in the From Nightmares book. And before you say it, I definitely think that this is supposed to be based on Barbaros, more or less. But I think there's definitely room in there for a more generic version of a similar model. Plus, any opportunity to get more models that carry Macoeedles into the game, I'll definitely take it. I really like the art for this model. This kind of gives me first edition vibes. It's definitely got a different style to it than a lot of the other models that we've seen recently, and I would love to see them do something like this and put it in the game. As far as keywords go, obviously you got Nephilim and Awakened. I think it makes a ton of sense that they would work with Castor or Nekima or both. It would be strange to see any Nephilim working with any humans. Barbaros was sort of a rare exception in that he had some sort of peaceful interactions with humans. But if they were going to justify something like that for a new model like this, then we would definitely need an explanation or a backstory to explain why that was working. Normally the Nephilim are just on site with any humans, and the Brood Fighters are particularly violent Nephilim, so good luck if you want to tame one. Now, similar to the Bayou, I could have done this entire video just on stuff from the Three Kingdoms and the 10 Thunders out of the From Shadows book. A lot of that stuff is actually coming to the other side, and I talked about it a little bit and how it might cross over to Malifaux in a recent video here, so check that out if you want to know about that stuff. I'm not going to cover any of the same ones again in this video. But this model is actually particularly interesting because it is an Oni, and this art has actually been around for a long time because it was in the Obsidian Gate Through the Breach Penny Dreadful that came out years ago. I was really expecting to see it come to the other side, and I was surprised when we didn't get it, but that obviously doesn't mean that it can't come to Malifaux at some point. Now, I looked up how to pronounce the name, and according to what I could find, it should be said Ju Che. Now, I'm probably butchering that, so I apologize. But according to this, in Japan, they're actually called Suzaku. So maybe I'll just go with that because I think I might be saying that right. Anyway, this thing really reminds me of a phoenix, which is not something that we've really seen touched on in Malifaux very much. It's got the Oni keywords, so of course it's probably going to work with Asami, which makes a lot of sense based on how her whole keyword works. But another interesting thing is that it works a lot with burning, and it's also immune to burning. And it would be interesting if it crossed over into Malifaux, maybe it will interact with the Burning Man in some way, and potentially team up with somebody like Riva or Karis. The Nopepo. So this is basically a Japanese style gelatinous cube. So obviously you can see how we need this as an addition to the game. Most importantly because we need the model so we can use it in Through the Breach. So this thing is a blob of meat. It's basically made up of a bunch of bodies that form into a sort of gelatinous blob and roll around consuming stuff. It's got a whole bunch of interesting abilities in Through the Breach, so I think we could kind of adapt that to work with a lot of different crews. We also learned from the blurb here that they're made by necromancers and they're particularly hard to contain, so they tend to draw a lot of attention. Now that immediately points me to McMorning because he's sort of on the run and tends to hide out in like sewers and stuff, so he could probably get away with having one of these around him without drawing too much attention. But because they come from Japanese mythology, it would be interesting to see Yanlo get involved a little bit. Maybe one of his retainers or one of his ancestors actually helps doing some of the research and potentially even gets involved with McMorning directly to come up with how to make one of these. Yanlo doesn't have a lot of dual keyword models with other masters, and he also doesn't interact a lot with the other Resurrectionist masters in the stories, so it would be interesting to see something to tie them together a little bit. So there's 10 models from Through the Breach that we might see coming over to Malifaux. Maybe as soon as a few weeks from now when Ashes of Malifaux comes out. Now, there's a whole bunch more stuff from Through the Breach that we could potentially see coming over to the game, so make sure you get in the comments below and let me know which of these was your favorite, or if there's another one that you're aware of that you want to see come over to the game and where you think they would fit. My favorite thing about all this is trying to figure out where the story might go and what characters would make sense in what crews and in what keywords. And I'm sure some of you agree, so make sure you get in there and let us know. Now, if you're excited about speculation and stuff like this, where we try to guess the new stuff that might come to the game later, then let me know because there's a whole bunch more stuff from Through the Breach that I could do videos like this on, or I could potentially do a video talking about characters that we've seen in the lore who haven't made it to any of the games yet who would be good candidates for coming to the game later. So let me know if you'd be interested in either of those things, and let me send a huge shout out to the Extremely Cool Kids tier on Patreon, the Steam Power Scoundrels, Dogmatized, and Black Ops Gladiator games. Thanks for watching.